Welcome to the Town and Country Podcast, two churches, one ministry. I am your host, Jonathan Illian, and we are glad that you chose to join us here today in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Today we have with us a man who used to be addicted to the hokey pokey, but he turned himself around, Pastor Kevin Richter, who is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran in Rhinebeck, Iowa. It is good to have you here, sir.
It's good to be here.
I'm glad you fought back from that terrible addiction.
That's why there's so many, loud thumps and bumps in the mic, is because I'm doing the hokey pokey and hitting the microphone.
Gesticulations everywhere. We also have with us a man who realized that he has a lot of growing up to do. Well, he realized this the other day inside of the fort he built inside his office. Pastor Gerald Kapanka, who's pastor at Immanuel Lutheran Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. I just wish I could figure out a way to build that moat.
I know.
Are girls allowed in this fort?
Well,
they have cooties.
Yeah, Maisie was disappointed.
Do we have enough cushions? That's the question. I just realized that I'm about to get fired, so possibly out of a cannon. I don't know. So we thank you both for being with us here today. Today we are continuing to talk about the topic Living Lutheran, and our main focus for this day is on the small catechism as a practical way of knowing how we should live our everyday lives. We're focusing on the fifth commandment today, which is, you shall not murder. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not do harm or we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need. Pastor Kevin, what do you got for us today on this particular topic?
Well, I'm just really glad Jesus talked about this particular topic because, I think if we were going through the commandments and we just left it with these 4 words, you shall not murder, 90% of us as Christians would be able to say, check, never done that one, okay, move on to the next one. But when Jesus, stops and talks about even he who hates his brother has, murdered him, now we're in a whole different ballgame. Now, okay, we got to stop and think about this. And as you look at that, we should fear and love God so that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need. This opens the door for so many everyday practical things. First of all, probably most of us have not actually murdered someone, but how many of us have legitimately wished someone would just go and die? That they're a pain in our rear, they are just a miserable person to be around, and it slips through our sinful head, life would be easier if they just weren't around, that just die, go to heaven, do whatever, and be out of my life, and that is breaking the fifth commandment. Hating, and boy, when we look at our world right now, the hatred, the division, the separation, how are we as Christians not playing into that and furthering the hate and the division and the separation, but rather reaching across those lines to help and support those people that we don't like, we don't agree with, whatever it is, in every possible way. And this also just opens the door for charitable giving. Why do we give food to food shelters? Why do we give clothing, clothes to clothes drives? Because this is the fifth commandment. When we feed the hungry, when we clothe the naked, when we visit the sick, when we do everything to help and support our neighbor in a physical need, which really is just, Matthew 25, the separation of the sheep and the goats, and Jesus listing all these things you've done, and he says, if you've done it to the least of these, you've done it for me. That's the fifth commandment, to make sure our neighbors have everything they need. And you can even take this so far as to, love your neighbor as yourself. Even days you don't like yourself, I bet you still feed yourself. I bet you still get up and put on the proper clothes to be warm and dressed. I bet you still, if you're sick, you take care of yourself. Why? Because you love yourself, and that's how we're supposed to love our neighbor, that no matter what, we're always seeking their physical well-being in every avenue.
Yeah, and I think that the timing of this particular topic, following the recent political election we've had in our culture and our society, really highlighted that we are living in a time where God speaks to our needs. We have such a culture of death that has surrounded and risen up in the last few decades around us in terms of the number one issue for one of the political parties was women's right to kill an unborn child. And they promoted that as this is the reason you need to elect our candidate, because we're going to protect your right to kill the unborn. And we a few decades ago, we never even would have celebrated that. We said they should be rare, and even if you supported abortion, they should be rare and uncommon, and we want to make them safe. Now we should celebrate the death of our children. But that's just one half of the commandment. We talk about thou shalt nots. But I think also the other thing that you said so rightly is, what should we do? We should help protect and defend our neighbor and support them in every bodily need. We need to reach out. I've watched, unfortunately, too many of those post-election debates and post-election analysis, and you hear people who are literally distraught over their candidate didn't win. And others who are gloating over the fact that their candidate did win. And, now we're going to make things, and there isn't a sense of saying, people are still in need. And we've got to find a way to reach out and help them. So the timing of this is just so powerful, because it's important for us to realize that the fifth commandment isn't just about taking someone's life, but it's also about how do we live our lives with each other.
Yeah, I was listening to 1517 podcast Thinking Fellows, and they did one. They actually recorded it the Monday before the election so that it would be released the Wednesday after the election. But it was all about winning or losing, and how do we as Christians, if our candidate won, be humble and not gloat and not rub it in people's faces, but just assure those who are distraught that it's going to be okay, and how do we help those who their candidate lost and feel like the world's coming to an end, see that no, God's still in control. It's still going to be okay. And I think, that reaching across the barrier, that breaking all these divisions and separations and hatred to just go love your neighbor no matter who they are is really what Jesus is commanding in this, And I was reading a story the other day about during one of the protests where there was, looting and rioting and burning down and all this stuff. The next day, father took his son out to go start cleaning up and repairing what he could. And he said, my son sat and watched the hatred on the news. I want to go show him love, that I'm going to take him out and show him we can do something about this to help heal and fix, and that to me is the fifth commandment of others have harmed and destroyed my neighbor. How do I go defend them and protect them?
And I think that that's really where, what our intent when we started this whole journey on Living Lutheran wasn't just to talk about the thou shalt nots of the commandments, which there are plenty of them there, but also what thou shalt.
Yeah.
And that care and concern for your neighbor. And we need that more in our culture and society today than maybe any time in my lifetime.
Well, because I think we could take this to the sanctity of life whole issue, right? I mean, not just the unborn, but the elderly, the assisted suicide, all these things that are happening in our world. But for most of us, that's not our day in, day out thing. That's high theology. Yes, we all want to fight for life. We agree that life is sacred. But how do I, as a Christian, live out the fifth commandment the majority of my life? It's seeing someone who I wouldn't normally help and saying, you know what? That's Jesus sitting there. I'm going to go love them and show them love, and whether it's the homeless person sitting outside the gas station or your coworker that just drives you absolutely nuts. How do you go out of your way to love them, protect them, provide for them so that they are safe?
So, I believe what you said at the very beginning, Pastor Kevin, about the fact that most people assume that they can just go ahead and check that box that I've never killed anybody, so I'm good. That opens our eyes to what it is to actually break this commandment, that it goes to hatred, it goes to malice against people that are probably really good people. It's just we don't agree with them. So what's the plan of action that we as Christians can do to implement that into our lives? You touched on it, that we treat everyone like Jesus, but sometimes that's not easy to do. In fact, all of the time, it's not easy to do. What is it that we can implement in our lives to make it work better for us?
Well, I think you brought up the point, and it's a good point that we can't cross this one off the list, check, I haven't kept it, because we break it daily. Yeah. And so anytime we see the law and see our sin, what do? We run to the cross, we receive the forgiveness, and we repent. You believe and repent. And Luther would say, that life of repentance, that holistic life. Because we break this commandment with our spouses. When we get in a fight and we're mad at them, that's breaking the fifth commandment. When our children, just tick us off because they're annoying us, that's breaking the fifth commandment. And really, you could take this to a righteous anger, and I was just having a discussion with somebody the other day, and all I ever say is I had a SEM prof tell me, we will never have righteous anger. Jesus had righteous anger. Our anger always comes with sin because it's always something selfish about, I don't like that, I don't want that. So, hate the sin, love the sinner, all these things. It's like, that's great, but actually just focus on loving the sinner. Just really focus on seeing that person as someone who needs the love of Christ. Because you know what? I'm a sinner who broke this commandment, and I need the love of Christ. And everybody that walks past me should not show me humility, compassion, kindness, but they do, and so how do I show that back to other people? And so it's really just, retraining your brain to confess yourself. I am a sinner who has been forgiven, and I want to go show the love that I have received to others.
And I think that's a powerful reality in terms of how do we actually do that. One of the things that I've had to get better at over the years is when I'm dealing with someone who is, maybe has a different opinion, maybe somebody who I would, break the fifth commandment against, whether through thought, word, or hopefully not too many deeds. I've had to force myself not to come in with a attitude of superiority or an attitude of, I'm going to repair this relationship. You're somehow broken, you're somehow damaged, and I'm going to come home and heal you. But approach that conversation, approach that person first in humility. Listen to where they're at. Listen to what their issues are. Before I try to correct, before I try to heal, before I try to make everything okay, I want to know who you are, and I want to listen to where you're coming from. And so many times, just on a practical level, living that fifth commandment is not as much about doing, but it's about receiving. Receiving, I want to know what's going on in your world that's caused you such pain, or that's given you such anxiety, or that's making you behave in a way that is making other people around you uncomfortable. And then when I can understand you better, then I can walk beside you and say, well, how can we deal with your issues? Rather than approaching and say, hey, you got an issue and I'm going to fix it because that's fifth commandment demands us do that.
Yeah.
That's not the approach we want to take.
And I think the other thing to that point, Jesus said, pray for your enemies. I just did this the other day. I've been angry with someone and they just drive me nuts. And
I apologize.
Yeah.
We all know it was me.
And I just had such hatred built up in me that every time I heard their name, every time I thought about them, it just would boil in me. And I just stopped. And it's after 2 months of fighting this, it's not once have I prayed for this person, And so I stopped right there and I just lifted them up in prayer, knowing there's a lot going on in their life. They've got issues, they've got things they're dealing with. And how they're treating me may not even be how they really want to treat me. It's just what they're going through and all these things. And so it's just stop and pray for them, because it's really hard to ask God to bless them and love them and watch over them and then still be angry towards them and want to go, fight them. Right. And I think that's the same thing. You brought up the great point of listening first. James would say, be quick to listen, slow to speak. And this is where we get in trouble in a technological world, right? Because text messages, emails, social media, there's no relationship. There's no listening. There's no looking that person in the face. There's no compassion to see them as a person. It's just a blank slate to say whatever I want to say and attack them, and this is going to set them straight, and I'm going to feel good about it, instead of sitting down one-on-one and looking them in the face and saying, I care about this person. I want to restore a relationship with this person. How do we do that civilly and respectfully?
And sometimes that means beginning with our own confession that,
yes,
I want to go out for a cup of coffee, and then begin the conversation is, I owe you an apology. You may not even realize it, but I've been harboring feelings that aren't faithful against you, and I just want to let you know that I'm sorry for those. That person may never even realized it, but it sets the tone for a restored relationship, a restored unity that God calls us. Now, before we go too far down, I think this is what we wanted to do with this. Can we also just overlook when there is just straight out, violence or sin or things that are wrong? Does this mean that we just pretend that those things don't exist?
No, I mean, this is where, we do speak out against sin. We call sin sin. I mean, Luther writes a lot about call a spade a spade. Sin, call a sin a sin. But I think the more important, instead of getting so focused on the sin and who's doing the sin and hating them, let's look for the victim of the sin. Let's look for who's being hurt by that sin and stand up for them and protect them and love them.
Yeah.
If you hear about sex trafficking and it's just you boil with anger for people who would steal children and do this, instead let your heart be broken for those children and pray for them and do anything you can to try to help the solution of this. And ultimately a lot of this comes from, it's not really our job to do justice. God is going to be the one. Let vengeance be mine, says God. It's not our job to go retaliate, to go bring about justice. Now, we do have justice systems in our world, and we can bring those people to courts and let them pay the consequences of their sin. But ultimately, the true justice is all God's. And so instead of us trying to be the prosecutor and all these people that are trying to bring about justice, let's just go look for the victims, love them, care for them, and show them any kind of protection and safety we can.
One of the things that that when you brought this up about let vengeance be mine, things like that, it comes to mind. I can't remember the court case, can't remember what happened, but a person murdered this individual's daughter, right? And the man got up and he said, "You killed my daughter, but I forgive you." But why do I forgive you? I don't want to forgive you. God has forgiven me, and therefore he commands that I do the same. And so I will pray for you. Whether that actually impacts the murderer's life at all, he started to cry, of course. I mean, I would imagine anyone with a soul would, but he let that forgiveness come even to someone who hurt him so deeply. And I think that that's a perfect example for all of us. And one of the things that I do want to say is I appreciate both of you making your humanity known. Many of us take a look at, many of us lay people look at pastors and say, well, they obviously don't do this. They know what to do. Well, they're human. They're sinners.
Well, they're also wrong because we don't sin. We wear the collar.
I was going to say, then they don't know me at all.
Listen, I know, but I'm just saying this to make people feel better. No, you guys, I believe, are the perfect example of people who know themselves, who know that they depend on Christ's forgiveness, and you show it in your messages, in your sermons, and that actually helps us to feel better when we do screw up. Well, okay, well, understand we're all human and we're all in this together. So I think that this is actually very helpful for people. So any other thoughts before we wrap it up?
The last thing I just want to say is, kind of what you said is, it's, and both of you have talked about it, but how we approach people. If you come to someone ready for an argument and a fight, of course they're going to bristle and get defensive. But if you come to them in humility saying, I played a part in this, I'm seeking reconciliation with you because I care about you, Lord willing, they're actually softer, they're ready to listen, they're ready to speak, because truly, if there has been hatred or any kind of thing like that, that there's a murder, a death, a separation of the relationship, the only way to restore life to it is through Christ. And that is both sides forgive each other. You're reconciled through your mutual faith in Jesus, and so the only way to heal a death is the resurrection. And so the only way to restore a broken relationship because of hatred for your neighbor or brother or spouse or whoever it is through the gospel, the forgiveness, the life in Christ, that we can be back in relationship again. We can protect each other again. We can love each other because Christ loves both of us.
And I just so appreciate the approach that this has taken to, because in the fifth commandment, you can spend a lot of time talking about, murder and euthanasia and abortion and those things. But that's not how we live our lives. We're not daily experiencing those things. And so putting this in the context of living Lutheran means living that fifth commandment in my relationship with every person around me. So that just exemplifies what our intent is in this whole podcast.
Very well said. All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us today for the Town and Country Podcast, Two Churches, One Ministry. We do want to remind you again to submit your questions for the next topic for the next podcast, which is Ask the Pastors. We've got some beauties coming up here, so please submit those to podcast@emmanuelcf.com so that we can answer those burning questions that you have. Special thanks go out to our audio engineer for this podcast, Mr. Dave Kaler. We thank you for your expertise, and on behalf of Pastor Kevin and Pastor Kapanka, I am your host, Jonathan Ilian. We invite you to come back next time as we bring you the next installment of the Town and Country Podcast. Thanks again, and have a great week.